My name is Oliver Cann. Thank you for joining us. This is the first issue briefing of the World Economic Forum on Africa 2019, our 28th meeting on Africa here at the World Economic Forum. We started in 1990. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with the issue briefing concept, it's a 30-minute type session. It's quite short compared to some of the other panel discussions. We try to kind of keep things a little bit more rapid and fast-moving. We're away from the rest of the sessions for a good reason. We're near the media center. We tend to make a bit of noise, so I encourage as much interaction between you here in the audience and us on stage. And the idea is that we tackle more current issues. And the current issue we're here to tackle right now is the South African government, and it's been around 100 days since the new administration began office. And it's really a health check to see where is progress being made? Is it happening fast enough? It's never happening fast enough for everybody, but is the direction of travel correct? Those kinds of questions. And I think after that, I'm going to leave it and let the conversation flow. I'm joined by Ann Bernstein, who is head of the Center for Development and Enterprise. I can't read my own writing here. It's a leading independent think tank. It's been on the scene a long time, and Ann's been joining us here at the World Economic Forum in Africa for many years now. So, Ann, let's start with maybe a bit of a take from yourself on where you feel South Africa is right now in this infancy of a new administration. What are you seeing that gives you hope? Where would you'd like to see a little bit more progress?
Well, South Africa is in a very difficult situation. I think you have to acknowledge that. We managed last year to get rid of a very bad president without a bullet being fired, and that's an achievement on this continent and in this globe, I think. And the president, I think, has had a long-term strategy, and he has made progress in certain areas. You have to acknowledge we're learning a great deal about corruption from the Zondo Commission. He has started the pushback on retrieving the institutions that the Zuma administration and the many corrupt people around that had infiltrated and essentially destroyed. We have new leadership at the South African Revenue Service. We have a new head of the National Prosecuting Authority who has to rebuild that institution. So, and there are a few other things. We have made progress, and I think it's important to acknowledge that fact. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people who, since the election, I think that the president should have capitalized on what was in many respects a personal election victory for himself. The ANC ran a campaign with him as on all the posters, and acknowledging that the ANC itself had to change and the country had to change. And I don't think he seized that moment and started to lead the country out of its many difficulties. We sit with an economy that is barely, well, pretty stagnant, let's put it that way. Our macroeconomics fundamentals are not sound. Our finances as a government are heading in an explosive path. And overall, the path South Africa is on now is not sustainable. So we have to make changes, and the question is how quickly. So I think there are many people in the business community and in society at large who feel that dealing with Eskom, appointing a new CEO, really making it the big changes that were announced in February have not happened. And this is a big change that is required. South Africa's challenge is that all of our issues are now big ones. Business likes to talk about low-hanging fruit. There is some low-hanging fruit, but the truth is, if you're president of this country, I think each issue requires you to deal with the trade unions, with vested interests, with a change in ruling party policy. And that's what makes things so difficult. So to sum up, I think it's been a disappointing period since the election. I think the country is in deep trouble. Our fiscal situation, on which we've just released a major report, is looking very bad, and we require stronger leadership. Then everything's fine and I'm proceeding as though everything's okay and I have a plan. I think that's the wrong approach at this time in South Africa's history.
So the plan is a good plan, but it's not happening fast enough, or there's not enough of the plan?
Well, I don't know exactly what the president's plan is, but I think it's not clear we don't have a new economic strategy, which we desperately need, and that's why we certainly are very supportive of the thrust from the finance minister in this economic policy document he's just released. That is the kind of direction South Africa has to go. It's a bold set of recommendations which have been floating around in some respects for a while, but he's putting it on the table and he's saying, let's make some decisions. Stop with all this, I've got to talk to this one, I've got to consult that one, I have to find a compact. I don't think that's going to happen. So last week, the release of a draft economic policy for discussion is, in our view, something that business leaders should be supporting, not all the detail, but the thrust of this, and should be looking to see how they can use it as a wedge for the kind of discussion on economic reform that's desperately needed. South Africa's got a lot of challenges. We've got to rethink our state-owned corporations, which are the big ones, are flailing, but they're very expensive. It's one thing to flail, it's another to do it where you are not delivering the services that the country needs efficiently and affordably, and where you're costing South Africa enormous amounts of money in endless bailouts. That can't continue. These companies must either cut expenditure or raise revenue, or they have to be completely rethought, and some will have to die if necessary.
It's disappointing that SOEs crop up on the program at this meeting, not just this year, but in previous years, and there is a huge amount of slow progress there. But let's just go back to your comment about speed. And we just had a press conference about half an hour ago announcing a public-private platform to unlock entrepreneurism, the Africa Growth Platform. And the comments across the panel were quite interesting. It was free up, not just entrepreneurs, but free up young people, free up women, but free up business, because policymakers are dragging them all down with time-consuming processes. But then I look back and I see progress on corruption, and maybe tackling the root of that and enabling a stronger government and the potential for consensus is what is necessary. Maybe this is a process that is necessary and maybe taking longer than one would like, but it has to be, we have to go through this before we can start reaching kind of speed and the direction of travel that you're looking for.
Look, I think first and foremost in South Africa, and I suspect in a number of other countries, but in South Africa you have to start with a new attitude to the private sector and competitive markets. It's got to be a positive attitude, and it's got to be one where profit is not a four-letter word, and where you see the dynamism and the value that private firms operating competitively can offer a society. And from that flow a whole lot of policy recommendations. I agree, you need to free up firms from the regulations, not that you don't need any regulations, but unnecessary regulation. Regulation that just adds obstruction and cost to firms, especially new firms and small firms, in starting up and succeeding. And yes, South Africa's president has committed us to moving from, I think it's 82 on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index to 50 in 3 years. But I think that's too slow. There are two issues. Does that index look at the right regulations, and will South Africa get rid of the right regulations that business is saying are holding us back, both aspirant businesses and big, small, and medium businesses? And why can't we do it faster? And what do we do about both new legislation and retrospective legislation? So it's the scope of this is very important. But there is a commitment, that's good. but the speed and scope is vital, and will it be the right regulations? So we're arguing, for example, if you want to get more dynamism in the South African economy, you do need to free up smaller companies, and they should be freed of regulations relating to both the wages you have to pay young people. So we encourage employers to employ more people, especially young people. And then the rules on hiring and firing. So you could take on more people easily, and if necessary and they don't work out, you could get rid of them easily. That's one issue. But also to be freed up more quickly than the rest of the economy, if necessary, from a whole range of regulations, including BEE. So there are a lot of things that relate to each other. So it's not just one's in favor of deregulation for some principle, it's because it will help the economy be more entrepreneurial. And if you're interested in employment, and South Africans have to be interested in employment, with such an enormous unemployment rate, you have to think about how do we make sure that our rules are encouraging employers to hire people rather than machines. So a very important set of issues that need to be thought through.
And we'll come to the fourth industrial revolution in a little bit, but first let's see if there are anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to add or throw in. Encourage you to challenge us here on the panel, or your fellow panelists or fellow audience members. So let's have, we'll take these two. So Ma'am, if you could just introduce yourself as well and let us know where you're from, please.
Hi, I'm Chantal from the African News Agency. I'd just like to know where the South African government is.
Okay, I can answer that one for you straight away. We invited them. We felt it was important that they joined us, and due to scheduling, we've been told that unfortunately they can't join us. So they were invited. Okay, gentleman in the front row. Wait a minute, let's just get that microphone so that our audience online can hear you as well.
I'm Itumeleng from Channels Television News. The question I've got is, if South Africa is going to encourage cross-border trade, what do you think the attitude of South Africans should be? I'm talking about this especially in the current light of the so-called xenophobic attacks.
So it's a question on regional integration. And look, I have to say this is not government policy here, but I think there's a genuine, valid discussion we could be having around South Africa and its commitment towards regional integration, which should stand the economy in very good stead. Any more? We can take one or two more questions if there are any others. Okay, Anne, let's talk about regional integration.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly not the South African government, and I don't speak for the government at all. All you get is me, I'm afraid. So I'm not a trade specialist, but let me raise one or two issues for you. I think South Africa, like many countries, is struggling with its migration policy. And you have to start there with what is going on in our society. So we need a more effective migration policy, not just in words, but in deeds. We need to think through very clearly issues about skilled immigrants and unskilled immigrants. I, for example, am in favor of wholesale immigration of skilled people to South Africa. We desperately need this for everybody in the country. And I think we need to, like many other places, we've got to think through how we manage unskilled immigration to the society. But we also need to think about all the people who are in the country. And it's not quite clear what the numbers are. Probably around 3 million, but nobody's quite sure. And obviously people who are in the country without documents are not going to be enthusiastic to announce themselves to officials. So I think you've got to start with what is the migration policy, number one. Number two, we need effective policing in times of trouble. And so the question becomes one, I don't think we know all the evidence about the terrible events of the last 10 days or so in different parts of mainly Gauteng, where I come from. But we need to know much more about how they started, who perpetuates these things, and criminality, and criminals must be dealt with. Is it true that there's some people provoking some of this violence? So I don't feel as though we know all the facts, but certainly we need to maintain the rule of law and make sure that it's applied without fear or favor. And that all South Africans and the people who live in this country obey the laws, and that we treat people under the rules of justice in our Constitution. So I think there are a number of issues here that have to be unpacked as we look at these very unpleasant events. But let me leave it at that.
But taking the big picture of regional integration, currently something around 17% of the region's exports are conducted within its border, compared to 60% in Asia and 70% in Europe. So it's clearly an easy win, one might think, to increase cross-border trade within Africa. Is this integration a process that South Africa is well placed to take advantage of?
But certainly, I'm in favor of it.
You're in favor of it, but
I think the country should, well, I'm not an expert on this issue. South Africa is very enthusiastic about the continental deal. And, you know, with trade come people. So we have to, again, it underscores, you have to get, I think ease across borders is vital, but you have to also think through your migration policy at the same time as you're sorting out your trade policy. You would think South Africa would be extremely well positioned to benefit from the growth that is taking place in the rest of the continent, and we are doing some, but we should be doing more. But many of our institutions have been hollowed out over the last decade.
Do you have perhaps any comments from people who see progress and don't think it's getting enough recognition, or they have particular prescriptions for areas that action needs to be taken quite fast? Anybody want to contribute to this discussion? So let's move on to the gentleman in the back row and gentleman in the front row. We'll take both at the same time.
Hi there, Michael Avery from Classic Business. Hi there, Anne. Good to see you again. I also wonder why the South African government wouldn't take this opportunity to come and address us in this new spirit of reform and the new dawn. And obviously sunlight is the best disinfectant. So one wonders why they haven't taken up the opportunity. That's just my 2 cents. I want to be specific on the labour issues. And the labour reform issues, as you mentioned, are not going to go away no matter how much social compacting you do. So specifically, what would you like to see the president do? We've got the national minimum wage. Ricardo Hausman has already said that it's the most bewildering decision he's ever seen by a government to implement a national minimum wage with such high unemployment. Can that be rolled back? Can you put that genie back in the bottle once it's been unleashed? And what further labour reforms would you like to see implemented to ensure that the labour stumbling block in particular is overcome?
Thanks, and we'll bring the microphone over to here as well. And Anna, I also want to be quite clear, we put this panel on at quite short notice, so I don't want to be too unfair to our friends in government. They didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this one. Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. My name is KK Fumba from Refinitiv, formerly known as Thomson Reuters. So I get a bit perplexed by the particular judgment on the slowness of government, particularly in the new dawn. The president that we have, and I know that this is going to sound like I am defending him, and I'm not. That just needs to be clear. If we go back to the negotiations right back in 1992, his style of working has always been that of an inclusive sort of a discussion, and let's really dot every I and cross every T in that sort of slow form, with some result at the end. And I think it's somewhat unfair at the moment to be saying that the wheels are turning quite slow, because I think in the pockets of what needs to be addressed to where we are as South Africa particularly, given the corruption issues and you know, I think you look at the various sort of forums, not forums, but the various commissions that have been set up to try and uncover all these issues. Because part of the problem, if you really look at the cases within government, as an example, the cases within government where people are sitting at home, still getting paid, with pending cases against them because of flawed processes that have been taken in taking disciplinary action. So I think to some degree there needs to be some space given to the government to deal with the issues in the perceived slowness that there is, right? Because I think ultimately we will be able to see result. I think with the, I mean, you made the comment again about Tito's sort of reforms that he spoke about last week. There is some action. Of course, there'll always be labor issues from the trade unions and so on, as we have seen, as a backlash onto how ESCOM should be dealt with, as an example. So in my view, as I'm concluding, I do think that, yes, I agree, things are turning slowly, but are they turning to the positive? Absolutely.
I just, if I may add to that, because we had a press conference earlier on today. PwC announced a deep dive CEO survey into Africa as part of a global survey, and they found that African CEOs are generally less pessimistic than CEOs elsewhere in the world. I don't have the numbers for Southern Africa, but there is there was the perception, if I'm characterizing it correctly, that people believe that after the short-term difficulties around the whole of the global economy is experiencing this year, they actually think things are going to get quite a bit better in the medium term, going out of it once again the next year or so out of the way. So again, maybe to your point that this is a slow but necessarily thorough process we just need to go through.
Let me deal with your question first, and then the labour issue. I started by saying that I think you have to acknowledge that, and I acknowledge, and various things that have turned for the better, particularly with, let's call it, state capture, okay? And this is no small thing. And recapturing the state for, let's call it, the constitutional lists is a hard business, and this is taking time. So I think that's the context in which I'm commenting. One of the problems, I think, is that on the one hand, one has to say, gee, this is a big job to turn the country around from all the problems of the past and reclaim it from the looters. You've got to be reasonable about this. You've got to rebuild institutions and so on and so forth. The problem is South Africa, the reclaiming is not operating in a vacuum. On the one hand, if our economy weren't in such trouble, if our fiscal situation weren't so dire, you could say, relax, we're turning in the right direction, and slowly but surely we're heading for a better quality of governance with all that flows from that. I think that the big challenges facing us is that so many things are happening at once. And for me, in that context, it makes it harder. And in that context, I'm saying, if you think of the billions of rands that we're having to throw at the state-owned companies alone, just to keep them afloat, we can't keep doing that. So we have to make those decisions quickly. And something that was sort of agreed, presented to Cabinet in February, we have yet to get clarity on. That was all I was saying. So for me, that's the context. It's not simple. I'm cognizant of the progress that has been made, but the world I live in and how I see it, I think we're not getting sufficient speed in certain areas and sufficient leadership to the country on where we're going and how. So it's hard. On the labor issues, I think it's now much easier to answer you. Let me tell you what was in the Treasury's document from last week on the labor front. So it's not just our opinion. I support what is in that document, where they call for a relook at collective bargaining, where you can do a deal and then impose it on non-parties. What does that mean? It means big companies and big unions make a deal, on a wage rate and conditions they can live with. And then they say to all the others, their competitors who are smaller or rural or whatever, you obey these rules. And we're saying, and now the Treasury is saying as well, we need to relook at that. That affects the creation of jobs and the smaller firms. So that would be one example of the change we want. In terms of the national minimum wage, it is a fait accompli. I think we're yet to see the impact that it's had. It's early days, about 9 months into its introduction. The unemployment rate is going up, but there are many factors that affect that. It would be unfair to say that we know that this is because of the minimum wage. I'm not opposed to minimum wages. I'm opposed to national minimum wages. South Africa had sectoral minimum wages, which were negotiated and agreed on. I think that's a much better route to go. The key issue now in terms of the national minimum wage is, will there be space to allow industries to incrementally pay the wages they currently paying and then move over a period of time, how long, to that much higher wage? If not, I think the Treasury's prediction of close to 750,000 jobs being lost might come to fruition. If you think of the furniture industry, the taxi industry, never mind other industries, they are nowhere near the national minimum wage per hour. So what can we do now in terms of incremental aspiration and exemptions? How that's all applied is going to be a critical issue, which we need to see what happens. But I don't think this was the right move for the country with this unbelievably high minimum unemployment rate.
Okay, we started a little bit late, so let's just get this lady comment or question in. Thank you. Ma'am.
Nicola Taran, NTI Consulting. Maybe just a follow-on from that, a question about how you see Treasury's role. Because we have so much policy uncertainty. So if we think, for instance, about telecoms policy, we know that the World Bank has told us, I think 3 years ago, that the fastest thing we can do is to release spectrum. ICASA hasn't been able to do that for about a decade. Now we have the Treasury saying that there must be a wholesale open access network, but fairly small, which is against most of the policy documents we've seen in the past 5 or so years. The Electronic Communications Amendment Bill has been withdrawn last year. Similarly, on the NHI, it's being pushed through Parliament. We're waiting for a Treasury paper in terms of the financing. Just want to get your views on how much we can hope the Treasury will keep the ship in the right direction, or is that not the way to peg our hopes?
I don't know. I think the Treasury was more powerful before the ravages of the last decade. They're certainly less powerful than they were, but this is still an institution of quality and seriousness about governing South Africa, which is more than we can say for a number of other departments. We're going to see. This economic policy document is going to be a big test of how strong Treasury is still and how much backing they get from above. So I think that's a critical question, but we don't know at this stage. I would come back to this gentleman in the front's important points. One of the things that we just released a document on the fiscal situation, which you might want to look at. It's on our website. Where, what do we do about this? And we try and set out our recommendations, which unfortunately are longer. The list is longer than we would like, but now South Africa has to fix a number of things on all fronts, not simultaneously, but you've got to recognize the scale of the package of things that have to be done. We've got to cut government expenditure. We have to deal with the SO, state-owned enterprises. We have to get growth going. And there's some reforms we have to make in order to get growth going. This is not a small list. We have, in the meantime, to say we can't afford all the things South Africa's already doing. Let's all be honest with each other. Do not add more things now. Whether it's, I would like more police officers on the beat, can't have it. You would like the NHI, or someone else would like the NHI now, you can't have it because we don't have the resources. Never mind what you think of it or how to get it and so on. So South Africa's got to choose some very hard things now. You know, do you want more money to go in bailouts to SAA, or do you want more money to go to the National Prosecuting Authority? My vote's for the National Prosecuting Authority. So that's one point. We can't add new things to the list, and we can't undermine any institutions the last decade left standing. So the debate on property rights needs to be seen in that context. The debate on prescribed assets needs to be seen in that context, that we're creating more uncertainty, more shaking the tree at the very time when investors are holding back and they want to see the direction the country's going, and is there a firm hand in the tiller to encourage investors to risk their money. So it's tricky, not just how we fix the past, but don't do any more harm.
And we're bang out of time, but just before we leave, I don't want to lose this meeting's earned reputation for positive thinking entirely. So I'm going to ask you to think about and share with us what you believe are some of the current or announced policies that the government is taking that do have the greatest potential for moving the needle.
I think the President has tried to change the discussion on the role of the private sector in our society. Think about 2 years ago, the conversation was about the evils of white monopoly capital. He has opened the door to a very different attitude to the private sector and its role in our society. I think the Treasury's document takes that into policy now, because who cares what you say in general, but it's what does it mean for policy prescription, and I think that is the right direction, and if we can push the Treasury sort of documents approach, not every last detail, but that approach, that would be very good for the country, and it builds on the President. A year ago at the Investment Summit, he said in Sandton, you know, it's time to see entrepreneurs as heroes. That's very good. I would like him to say that all over the country and into his own party and his government as often as possible. So I think that's a really positive shift, and we've got to stick with that shift if we can. I think the announcements he made in February, if he will stick to them about really restructuring Eskom and acting to stop the bleeding and turn this around so we have electricity, is absolutely vital, and he's got to stick to what the task team have recommended and others. So I think there are some positive signals. He's got to get out of the mire of everyone in his alliance has to agree. At the end of the day, I think he got a massive endorsement for himself personally as president in the elections in May. And he has to take that mantle as president of the whole country and be less concerned about unity in the ANC. Easy for me to say, but that's the big choice.
Well, Anne, we're grateful for you to you for joining us here at the last moment and helping this panel. It's been an important one. We will try to continue this discussion, this narrative, and see maybe if we can schedule something for another time towards the end of the meeting as well, to see what we've learned over the course of the meeting. But for now, thank you. Thank you for joining us here in the room. Thank you for watching us live online. This session is now over.
Thank you.